Welcome to Politics Chat, in which I try to answer your questions about modern politics. There was something that I really wanted to make sure people were aware of, and that's that Vice President J.D. Vance was in Maine today to talk about fraud and the cost of fraud in our political system. And this is part of a program that the Trump administration has been pushing since March. The idea that the real problem with our government is that certain people, and usually they're people that are coded black or immigrant, are creating fraud in our system. And you remember this from the very beginning of the second Trump administration when Elon Musk and his Department of Government Efficiency people came in and said they were combating waste, fraud, and abuse. It became sort of this catchphrase. And of course, we know that in fact they saved no money at all from the government. But what they did do was they cut a lot of programs that people cared deeply about, and they scooped up a lot of our identifying information into private databases that are now being used in ways that were not apparently legal. So, this idea of there being fraud out there is very much a political project, and I wanted to give you a little bit of background about what was going on with it. So the Republicans have perfected a technique for a long time now. It's really became very obvious in the 2000 presidential election, but it's an old propaganda technique in which you accuse your opponent of what you yourself are doing. And we tend to identify that in modern American politics with Karl Rove, who's a Republican operative, but in fact, it's an old propaganda technique that is often identified with Nazi Germany. And the idea behind it is that if you accuse your opponent of what you are doing, it's very difficult then for people to understand when the opponent comes back and says, well, wait a minute, you're doing it too. And what that does is it creates confusion so that people tend to throw out both sides of the equation and say, well, they're both corrupt or neither is corrupt. It muddies the waters around that issue. And you saw it, for example, with the Republicans going after the presidential campaign of John Kerry, accusing him of being weak on defense and actually not being part of the American military the way he had been. That was the swift voting, it was called, of John Kerry, and it managed to erase that real strength of Kerry's campaign from the political equation because they had managed to accuse him of being weak on support for the military when it was in fact the other way around. So what you're seeing right now with this attempt to suggest that opponents of the Republicans are creating fraud is really this political technique brought into the modern moment. And just let me lay out some of the facts first and then explain to you what I think is going on. So Maine is a great example of a place where the Republicans are insisting that there's a huge amount of Medicaid fraud that in fact is not borne out by the actual numbers. So, in any program, private as well as public, there's always going to be fraud, but because people are going to people, right? But there are actually a number of organizations, anytime that you have a federal program that is designed to guarantee that there isn't that kind of fraud in a huge way. So federal reviewers, people from the federal government who reviewed the Maine Medicaid program. And remember, Medicaid pays for elder care, a lot of elder care and hospitals and so on. So it's pretty popular in Maine, that this is where people are getting their attention for their older relatives and for older people themselves. Federal reviewers identified only about 0.1% of total program spending as monetary losses where payments were determined to be incorrect. Now, that's going to be a lot lower than what you're hearing from people like J.D. Vance, because he's focusing on what are called improper payments. But improper payments are almost always paperwork issues. That is, they'll be missing paperwork or incomplete paperwork, or the documents were submitted incorrectly, or there was an administrative mistake, or there's a place where you need additional review. When they go and do that, as I say, they've discovered that about 0.1%, which is significantly lower, by the way, than the national average, has turned out to be an improper payment. And just for comparison, it's worth remembering that while they're focusing on the state of Maine and with the idea that somehow, because Maine has a Somali population, of course, the Republicans have been going after the Somali populations in places like Minnesota and Maine. The Florida Senator Rick Scott led a hospital company that paid what at the time was a record settlement with the federal government. And their record settlement over Medicare and Medicaid fraud allegations was $1.7 billion. That is, they had done so much that was fraudulent, they paid a settlement of $1.7 billion. So this idea that somehow the people who are causing trouble are the individuals in a system, in a very complicated system, versus the companies that are ripping off the federal government is really, really deeply problematic. It's also worth pointing out that for all the fact that the Republicans are talking about cracking down on fraud, the president himself has granted either pardons or clemency to more than 70 people who are either allies or donors to his campaign and to his political action committees that have been convicted in fraud cases, not accused of it, but convicted. So this idea of there being something that the Republicans are being strong on is just a complete reversal of what's going on. And if that's the macro, I'm sorry, the micro picture, if you will, there is a macro picture as well. This is the most corrupt administration in American history. And I say that having studied American history now for a really long time and focusing on corruption. This is one of the things with my intersection of politics and economics that I do a whole lot of. And in fact, if I have time, I'm going to actually throw some stories out to you about other administrations that you remember as being particularly fraudulent when characterized by corruption and fraud when they weren't necessarily. But this one is basically has thrown out the window all of the safeguards that we have to protect against corruption. The independent inspectors, for example, have simply thrown up their hands and said, we're not going to pay any attention to the emoluments clause, which is there to make sure that members of the administration can't profit from their association with it, presidents, for example, or vice presidents. And by the way, this really seems to be centered around the Trump family and President Trump, not so much, and other people as well, but not J.D. Vance. There may be things there, but the places I've really seen them are around the Trump family. There's a lot going on in that administration. But let me give you some statistics about what I'm talking about. The journalists who are following the corruption of the Trump administration, and there are many now, estimate that the Trumps have increased their wealth $4 billion, $4 billion since Trump took office the second time. It's worth remembering that Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his business and his, that is Trump's business partner, Steve Witkoff, who was part of the construction of the World Liberty Financial cryptocurrency company or crypto company that the Trump family is deeply involved in. They have both been negotiating in the Gulf for theoretically the United States, although neither is an elected official, and Kushner calls himself a volunteer, while they are also trying to raise $5 billion there on top of the $2 billion that the Saudi royal family, the sovereign wealth fund controlled by Saudi leader MBS, put $2 billion into a private equity firm that Kushner runs. The So there's this, this real operating on this level of looking for foreign money while theoretically working for the US government. There has also been, of course, the fact that Trump's tariffs were often leveraged to do things to get him and the Trump organization deals with places like Vietnam to build resorts in that country that would have taken a lot longer to get permission to do, were it not that the Vietnam government was desperate to get lower tariffs at that point. It's also worth remembering that Don Jr. and Eric Kushner are investors in a drone company that has gotten major contracts from the U.S. Defense Department. Worth remembering that when Hunter Biden was, when his father was in government, he was not in the government, and the administration I'm sorry, the Republicans in the House especially, but in Congress, kept trying to tie Joe Biden to the idea that he was taking money from China. And there was never any there. They're not saying anything about this. And we're talking billions of dollars of corruption here. There's also the fact that there is a lot of money flowing into the Trump family and the Trump organization through their cryptocurrency company that is untraceable. And, again, this is where a lot of that money comes from. Zach Everson, who was at Forbes and now is with Public. I'm drawing a blank on the last name of that. Look for Zach Everson. He's followed a lot of this material. But then there's also you can really see in a microcosm what's happening here with Trump's projects in Washington, D.C. The money is funny there. So like the Biden administration got a bid at one point for the repair of fountains in Lafayette Park of about $3.3 billion. Now, Trump went ahead and gave a no bid contract to the same company that's redoing the ballroom that he wants to build, or that is building the ballroom that he wants to build, for, I believe it was $17 million. And there's a lot of, similarly, he keeps talking about that reflecting pool costing $1.2 million. And in fact, the number is already at 13. There's like a lot of places where the money has suddenly gone real high. And when questioned about it, he turns hostile. And, at one point yesterday, he called one of the reporters, just said she was dumb for asking that question. But remember that ballroom was initially supposed to be $200 million, all paid for by private money, then $400 million. And now there's a price tag of $1 billion just on the security for it that the Republicans in Congress want the American taxpayers to pay. And there's a real question, as I say, about where that money is going, because there's no transparency around it. And similarly, there's a big fight right now over Trump's presidential library in Miami, which apparently the state of Florida made over to him 3 acres of prime real estate for $10 is the number I read. And he has said he doesn't want an actual library. He wants it to be more like a hotel, which all of a sudden he seems to have walked away with very valuable Miami real estate for almost nothing to build a hotel on. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff going on that is not transparent and that just reeks, to be honest. So there you have all those things going on, but then there's also, I think, symbolic of that, the fact that when Trump went to China a couple days ago, he did not take with him members of the usual government people that you would see around him, so much as he took with him 17 billionaires, leaders of corporations. And people are calling it the $1 trillion delegation, because they're there theoretically on a US state visit, but they're really members of companies who are looking to get deals out of China. And that has been a hallmark of a lot of what Trump has done in office. There's also the issue that he has pretty clearly tailored a lot of his policies around what is good for the fossil fuel industry. And remember, during his campaign, he was caught on tape telling people who ran fossil fuel corporations that they ought to give huge sums of money to his campaign because it would pay off for them in deregulation, in his policies, and in tax cuts. And of course, they did give a lot of money, and it did pay off for them. There's also the fact that he has pardoned a huge number of people under somewhat suspicious circumstances. That is, a lot of money will go into one of his organizations, and then somebody will get a pardon. Now we're seeing, as well as of this morning, the fact that while the Ultimate Fight Club um, event that's supposed to be held in front of the White House on Trump's 80th birthday is supposed to be free, but Trump is going to be the person who decides who gets those tickets, and they appear to be being exchanged for sponsorship of the event, and it's not clear at all where the money for that sponsorship is going to go. And there is also, although that is Trump, of course, there's a lot of this rot that is spreading throughout the administration, not only to people associated with the family, but you can't really look away from what happened under, at the time, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem, things like the $143 million ad campaign that appeared to go to a personal friend of her associate, Corey Lewandowski. And there's also a lot of stuff that really we're only scraping the surface of. One of the things that the new Homeland Security Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen had to contend with when he got into office was the fact that the department has spent more than $1 billion to buy 11 warehouses to house detainees. That, of course, is being challenged in the courts, but that's a lot of money for 11 warehouses. So what we're going to see, I suspect, as time goes on is real uncovering of extraordinary corruption. Now, what's interesting about this, and why I wanted to make it a connection between it and the fact that Vance is out there now talking about how they're the ones defending against corruption, is because, as you know, the Trump administration and the radical right in America really patterned itself after Viktor Orbán in Hungary, who undermined his own country's democracy. And Orbán was infamous for corruption, for basically giving deals to cronies and really taking a lot of the money out of the country's coffers. Which, by the way, I'm watching very closely the skyrocketing US debt. And the fact that the administration doesn't seem to have any plan at all for addressing it, except to continue to cut programs that Americans really like, which to me is not the correct answer. And I'm really concerned about where this goes when the music stops, personally. And I call your attention to the fact that Trump bankrupted a number of businesses, seemingly by treating them like slush funds. And I feel not a little bit, I feel a lot like that's what's happening to the US Treasury right now, with the degree to which we're bailing out other countries and getting involved in military operations in other countries. Remember, of course, that Iran is costing us $1 billion a day. That's a problem, right? But Orbán, as you know, was toppled by a popular movement back in April. And one of the things that you can see, if you're interested, is you can go on social media and see videos from Péter Magyar, the person who is now the prime minister of Hungary, who took over from Orbán and who's really kind of scratching away at the corruption in that administration. And you can see the spaces that Orbán's people built for themselves, the palaces that they built for themselves at a time when the economy of Hungary was falling apart, in part because of the fact that they were so corrupt and they were tearing apart the rule of law. And there are many reasons to care about the rule of law. One of them is that people are not willing to invest in a country where they cannot trust the legal system, because you could lose everything at any moment if you have a corrupt judge simply turning against your particular company, which is what happened in Orbán's Hungary. So you can look at these videos and you can see the degree to which they're going to infuriate people in Hungary. And you can also look at the fact that one of the things that really bothered Putin in Russia, Vladimir Putin in Russia, was when Alexei Navalny, the leader of the opposition, who has since been killed by the regime there, exposed the fact that Putin and his cronies had been skimming money out of the public treasury and building palaces to themselves. So this issue of corruption is one that really can topple even a strong man. And I think that the administration is very aware of that. And it's especially at a time when inflation is coming in hotter than people had expected, even with the higher cost of the fuels that we need to get products to market that have been skyrocketing because of the Iran war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Trump is increasingly out there on a limb as it's harder and harder for people to make ends meet. The quotations from earlier this week saying, I don't think about anybody's finances when I think about dealing with Iran. I think he was trying to say, I'm a strong man here. I just care about nuclear weapons, which, by the way, is deeply problematic because his own intelligence agencies said that those really weren't going to be a real hazard for the United States for a decade, but they're really doubling down on that. But the more that Americans are hurting financially, the worse this corruption is going to look. And, it's pretty visible in things like that reflecting pool, which the Trump administration is painting bright blue, which even if you think that's a good idea, which the vast majority of Americans do not, it's a lot of money. It's up to like $13 million. He keeps saying it's 1.2, but the actual number is 13, I believe, a little bit above that. It was a no bid contract he gave to somebody. And it's pretty visible because it's bright blue. It's hard to look away from that. Hard to look away from that arch that he is now putting up, and which I might point out frames Robert E. Lee's house in Arlington. Little bit of rabbit hole. You may not know that the Arlington National Cemetery was begun during the Civil War on the site of Robert E. Lee's plantation, quite deliberately as a sort of FU, that he had killed all these all these Americans, and they were burying him around his plantation. I could tell you actually a lot of interesting things about that house, but I'm not right now. So, there are a lot of ways in which that corruption and the waste of public dollars on vanity projects or on Trump's supporters is going to be increasingly visible. And that's going to be harder and harder to stomach as it's harder and harder to put food on the table and gas in the car. So I think they're really, really aware of that. And they're really trying to defang that issue by claiming it's the Democrats or their opponents who are committing fraud. So I really wanted to call that out and make sure people see it and call it out when you see it, because this is, as I say, that classic example of taking your real weakness and accusing your opponent of it, or undermining your opponent's strongest arguments by accusing them of it. And this, I think you can see pretty clearly, this is going to be the issue they're going to try to go in front of the American people with. And I just wanted to make sure people saw that, because weirdly, in many ways, when you think of all the things that people can be concerned about with their politicians, corruption is really one of the ones that brings down regimes. Which I actually think that's really interesting. But I wanted to give you a couple of examples of how powerful accusations of corruption are. And I'm going to start with two words that you know of from high school history, and you don't remember what they are, but you just know they're really bad: Crédit Mobilier and Teapot Dome. And let me give you a quick version of what those are, because interestingly enough, everybody associates Ulysses S. Grant, President U.S. Grant, with Crédit Mobilier, and they always say he was corrupt. And I kind of love this story because that was a political hit on him. In fact, the story of Crédit Mobilier and I won't give you the whole story because it's a financing story of U.S. railroads. And someday when all this craziness with Trump is over, maybe I really will do a show that's just called Historical Rabbit Holes, because there's a lot of really cool stuff running around back there. But I'm not going to give that to you now. I will tell you that in the election of 1872, there was a group of people who had split the Republican Party and were really eager to find an issue on which to go after Grant, who of course had won the Civil War for the United States and so was really, really popular, especially among Black voters in the South and among people who had fought in the war, which was most American men, right? And women aren't voting at the time. So they're looking for something to weaken him. And what they come up with is the idea that he and Republicans in Congress have corruptly taken money from a certain branch of the Transcontinental Railroad. And by the way, there were many branches of the Transcontinental Railroad. When they wrote the bill, they put a lot of different railroads together. And one of them, the Kansas Pacific, was crazy corrupt. They were like literally handing out bucks, but that was actually a different group of people than the Transcontinental Railroad people were. They had to bring some of them on board, but then they really marginalized them in those early years. And the railroads are going to be crazy corrupt later as well. And the railroads in New York are going to be corrupt. But in that period, the Union Pacific is not corrupt. But what happens is, before the 1872 election, there's this newspaper that's trying to get rid of Grant because the guy who's in charge of it supports the Grant's Republican opponent. And he hits on this story that the guy who's running the Transcontinental Railroad, the Union Pacific Railroad is the name of the corporation, I'm sorry, that he actually gave money to bribe a number of people in Congress, Republicans in Congress. But what's great about that story, and if you are at all interested, you can read this whole thing. Okay, I'll admit it's maybe a little bit not bedtime reading for a lot of people, but it's in the New York Sun, and the New York Sun is reproduced in the Library of Congress website on American newspapers, which is a huge deal for people like me, because when I was in graduate school, you really couldn't get the Sun. It was on microfilm and it was crazy expensive. So there were only like 2 copies of it running around for people to get through interlibrary loans. So it was really, really, really hard to get. And now you can just sit and read it. It's a very important newspaper. Anyway, the Sun runs this story in which it says they have an envelope of the amounts of money that the bribes were. So then there's a lawsuit over it in Pennsylvania. And in the lawsuit, they actually dig into this story. And when it turns out that this guy in Pennsylvania wants to buy into Crédit Mobilier, and he says he wants to do it. And then he goes on vacation for the summer for like months. And he comes back, and by then the price of it has exploded. And he writes to the people in charge of it, and he says, I want to go ahead and buy those stocks I told you about now at the price that it was when I told you I wanted to buy them. And they write back and they're like, dude, that's not happening. I mean, you buy them at what they're worth now, but we're not going to do this retroactively back to before you went on vacation. So he gets really mad, and he claims that he was sitting in the office when he overheard a conversation about the bribery. And so he wrote it on the back of an envelope. That's the story of how that Crédit Mobilier scandal makes it into American parlance and into then the rest of the newspapers at the time, because they're also trying to bring down Grant. And yet, after all these years, you think about Grant and what people think is Crédit Mobilier. Again, I know it's a complicated story, but it was also a real BS story. There were many reasons that Grant had trouble in his party, but corruption was really not one of them. Anyway, let me give you the other one, and then I'll let you go. The other one you hear about is Teapot Dome, and you know that was bad, right? And it always amuses me that it happened during the Harding administration, because Warren G. Harding in the early 1920s, because was that even a real administration? I'm sorry, I know it was, but it just never seems real to me. It was, though. And the story behind Teapot Dome is that literally a guy who runs, he's an oil baron, shows up with a suitcase with $100,000 in it in 1920. So we're talking beaucoup bucks, right? Gives a suitcase with $100,000 in it, and then another $25,000 loan to Harding's Secretary of the Interior in order to lease oil lands. There's actually a switch there. The oil lands had been part of a different department in the government. To lease the oil lands. Basically, it says, if you give me $100,000 on a loan, I will let you lease lands that have oil under them in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California. That did happen. That was true. And that, when you think of everything that happened under the Harding administration, that's what people remember. So I'm using that as an example to say to you, that's what the Trump administration is trying to get away from. They don't want people to think blue reflecting pool corruption. They want them to think Medicare fraud corruption. And that's, I think, the ground on which we're going to see the midterms play out. And I wanted people to be forearmed because they are going to flood the zone about this. This is going to be out there. And just remember that if they can sell that to enough voters, they can keep using the Treasury, our tax dollars, as a piggy bank. And that's not going to come out very well. If you'd like to tune in live, I record these chats on Tuesday and Thursday at 6 p.m. Maine time on both my YouTube channel and my Facebook page. If you want to hear more from me, I write Letters from an American every night. It's available on Substack and on Facebook, and the audio version of the nightly letter is available the following day wherever you get your podcasts. And finally, on Saturday mornings, I talk with Dr. Joanne Freeman, the historian of the early republic, professor, and dear friend about history and politics. We call our talks What the Heck Just Happened, and you can find them on YouTube. Politics Chat is produced by Lauren Westfall, music by Andrea Von Kampen.